Chad Hasty Show, News Talk 95.1 FM and 790 AM KFYO. Joining us on the phones right now, Republican strategist Matt Mackowiak joins us on the Chad Hasty Show. Matt, good morning. How are you today?
I'm doing great, Chad. Good morning.
Good morning, and I guess we can start off with the Democrats, at least some of the leading Democrat contenders, have been releasing their tax returns and, of course, kind of getting in the jabs that President Trump should do so as well. I don't think the average voter, ever goes through these things or cares, but it is kind of interesting, some of these tax returns and what they tell us about some of these candidates, correct?
It can be. I don't think it affects how voters view candidates. There's no requirement that you release your taxes. It's been basically an established practice, basically going back to Nixon, that the nominees of both parties have released their taxes, and so everyone's done that except Trump. I think two things to point out on the taxes. First, on Beto O'Rourke, I saw this morning the Wall Street Journal had an accountant review Beto's 10 years of taxes and found that he took more of a benefit from medical expense deductions than he should have, and he owes $4,000. So he's going to have to write a stroke a check to the IRS. The more interesting thing to me, though, is Bernie Sanders, who is basically tied up in knots over this issue of him now basically revealing that he's a millionaire. He said last night that on a Fox News town hall that he does not believe that because he's become a millionaire that he's benefited from or realized the American dream. He said, well, I wrote a successful book. Anyone can do that, as if that were possible. So
yeah, it's real easy. Jody has 4 of them over there. So
yeah. The other thing I just noticed, which I just tweeted out, is that if you look at his tax returns, I think it was last year, he made something like $1 million. It might have been the year before. He only gave about 1% to charity, so like over $1 million in income and about $10,000 in charitable contributions. Pretty minor in terms of his generosity there. So, look, I don't think the tax issue is all that important. In terms of the political media, they sort of hound you until you release them, and then once you do, it's probably it's kind of the end of their level of interest, unless the taxes reveal something that can create a problem for you long term. I think one of the things to watch going forward is going to be Joe Biden's taxes. There's going to be great interest to see how much money he's made giving speeches, and I imagine there'll be a pressure on him like there was on Hillary to release transcripts of his speeches, because I'm sure he's given speeches to some groups that the Democratic left won't like, including banks and other potential organizations. So, yeah, I don't think the tax issue matters all that much.
Yeah. Let's take a look at, as far as the money game goes, the president and the RNC announcing that they've brought in quite a bit of money. About $76 million in the first quarter?
Yeah, it's one of the, in many ways, undercovered or underreported stories of the last couple of years. Both the Trump reelection campaign, which launched the day after he was sworn into office, and the RNC have been really just killing it on fundraising. And it's really, I think, going to give the president a great opportunity to be reelected. He raised more money last quarter than the top 2 Democrats did combined. They're raising the vast majority of it from small dollar donors. They're bringing new donors into the fold, and they're setting records. I think they raised something like 9 or 10 or maybe even 12 times as much as Obama did in the same quarter of his reelect. So he's going to be able to build up a pretty massive war chest over the next year. Obviously, once the Democrats have a nominee, there's going to be a flood of contributions from Democrats to that person to try to defeat Trump. But he is clearly going to raise, I think, $1 billion and going to have the resources to run a far more sophisticated campaign for re-election than he did in 2016.
Yeah, and I want to ask you about the Democrats. Obviously, you've got so many Democrats who are running for president right now. The top tier maybe are reporting some decent numbers as far as donations go. Those are going to keep going. And we still have a long ways to go before there's a nominee for the Democrats, and a long ways to go before Election Day for President of the United States. do the Democrats run a risk of tapping out some of those small donors because you have so many candidates out there and you have so many people begging for money?
I don't think, I think most people who've worked in campaigns recognize that small dollar donors really can't be tapped out. It's one of the advantages of small dollar donors is that once they've contributed one time, they're invested in your success, and so you can go back to them. And what you're also seeing is you're seeing people give to more than one candidate. If you're only giving $25, you might be able to afford to give to 3 or 4 candidates. And I do think that's one thing you're seeing in this presidential primary is that there are very few voters who really only like one Democratic candidate, particularly since there's such little difference in where a lot of these folks are ideologically. They're basically all for the same things. They may be for slight differences in how they'd approach each issue, but they're basically all for the same core thing. So, I think the Democrat nominee is going to have just a massive amount of money come in once it's clear there's a nominee. Now, I do think, and I forget if you and I have talked about this on the air, but it's something I've talked to other people about. I mean, in fact, there's a New York Times story this morning about concern inside the Democratic Party that Bernie Sanders, number one, maybe end up being the nominee and not be electable, but number two, may be strong enough that they get to the convention where no one has a majority of the delegates.
Yeah.
And so there's a debate inside the Democratic Party as to whether they should sort of unify to try to stop Bernie now, or does that sort of play into his kind of message as a candidate about going up against the establishment, up against the power structure. So I think that's one thing to watch. The Democrats have two important differences in the way that their primary goes. One is they have proportional allocation of delegates, and so if you win 15% of the state's votes, or in some cases the congressional district's votes, you get a proportional allocation of delegates from that state, right? So there's no winner take all. So it's going to be, no one's going to probably build up a massive lead. It's going to be 3 or 4 people probably amassing delegates. But the second thing to watch is that Super Tuesday occurs 4 days after the fourth early state contest. It's very early this year, and after Super Tuesday, you're going to have 40% of their delegates allocated. So the point is there may not be all that much of a sort of winnowing effect until after Super Tuesday, at which time you only have 60% of the delegates left, which are going to be allocated proportionally. So my point is, I think there's a greater chance the Democrats will go to a contested convention in 2020 than at any time in the last 30 or 40 years. And that's going to have pretty big ramifications because, again, we talked earlier about how the Democrats are going to want to unify behind their nominee financially. They can't do that if they don't have a nominee until whenever their convention is. I think it's in June or July in Milwaukee.
That'll be fascinating to watch if that plays out that way. Let's talk about two of the different candidates. Julian Castro is just, it seems like he's not doing anything as money-wise. I mean, he's not getting any momentum. He raised about $1 million in the first quarter. What's his strategy here? What is he trying to do?
I don't know. I think if you look at the fundraising reports, his was by far the weakest relative to the strength that the candidates should have, relative to how long they'd been in the race. Beto got in pretty late in the quarter, and I think is maybe second or third in cash on hand, and second or third in overall dollars raised, around $9 million. Julian had, if I remember, most of that quarter and really just barely got over the $1 million mark. You have a fairly irrelevant former congressman from Maryland named John Delaney, who's pretty wealthy, who's not even raising money, and he raised about half in the first quarter of what Julian raised. So, look, I don't know what he's doing or what their strategy is. He's hired, some staff in the early states. He's doing this 50-state strategy where he's trying to travel to all 50 states. I guess trying to signal that he's in this for the long haul. I do think, as the only Latino on the Democratic side, that could ultimately end up being valuable, either in states with large Hispanic populations or valuable politically as they're selecting a VP or a cabinet down the road. So he may end up being in the mix in some way, but it's pretty clear now he's not going to be the nominee, and I think that does raise questions about his commitment to staying in the presidential race.
Now, before I let you go, what do you attribute the rise of Mayor Pete to?
Well, I think he's talented. I mean, I think we have to be honest about that. He's, very authentic. He's younger. He's from a newer generation. He's got an impressive biography. I think people are going to dig into his record as mayor of South Bend. It's the fourth largest city in Indiana. There's a huge question mark as to whether that truly prepares you to be president of the United States and commander-in-chief. I think Democrats are going to say, well, Donald Trump wasn't prepared. Well, that's an argument they can make, but it may not be enough because they're going to have a number of other candidates up on those debate stages that are going to be prepared and pass the gravitas test, I think, on national security and foreign policy. So we'll see whether this is just a boomlet that's happening early in the year when people aren't paying that much attention. We'll see whether it's sustainable. I think the question for Mayor Pete is, can he scale? Can he run a first-tier nationwide front-runner type of campaign at this point? Is he raising the money he should be raising given the momentum he's getting? And I don't think we know that yet. But he clearly is talented, and I think he has a chance to ultimately be one of their 4 or 5, final candidates in this thing, and that was pretty unimaginable a month or two ago.
Yeah, absolutely. Matt, tell folks about your podcast and also your newsletter.
Yeah, the podcast is called Mac on Politics. 195 5-star reviews in the iTunes store. You can find it there, Google Play, Stitcher, Spotify, and at MacOnPoliticsPodcast.com. The most recent episode is with Josh Holmes, former Chief of Staff to Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell. We talk all about 2020. And then the newsletter, which I know you're a subscriber to, as well as lots of others. Over 3,000 Texans receive the Must-Read Texas morning email. Each weekday morning we take all the top news, deliver it right to your inbox in a clear, clean format. You can sign up for a free 1-week trial at mustreadtexas.com.
All right. As always, Matt, appreciate your time. We'll visit with you down the road.
Sounds good. Have a great week.
You too. That's Matt Mackowiak.